Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and to our two witnesses. Earlier this month, a prominent Mexican labor lawyer, Susana Prieto, was arrested on trumped-up charges and subsequently denied bail in retaliation for her labor advocacy, which comes on the eve of the implementation of the USMCA, in which ensuring Mexican labor standards is clearly a vital component. When asked about Ms. Prieto's arrest in a Ways and Means Committee hearing, U.S. Trade Representative Lighthizer shared that he believed that Prieto's arrest was a bad indicator, quote, bad indicator of Mexico's commitment to labor reform. As Mexican President Obrador is set to visit Washington, of course, this month, I urged President Trump and Secretary Pompeo to raise that matter and stress its importance to the United States. My first question is directed to you, Mr. Ambassador. I trust that you believe that heads of state should respect the separation of powers and the constitutional roles of each branch of government. Is that a fair statement?
Yes, sir.
I'm glad to hear that. So I have a series of questions about El Salvador, where President Bukele continues to undermine democratic institutions. Do you believe it was appropriate for him to send El Salvador's armed forces to the National Assembly after lawmakers refused to give him the funding that he had asked for?
No, and we said so at the time.
Yeah, I presume it's not the right approach to civil-military relations, of course. My second question is relative again to the National Assembly, which passed legislation twice that did not give the president the authority that he wanted. Both times, President Bukele put in place executive orders undermining the Assembly and granting himself those powers. Also, both times, the country's constitutional court ruled that President Bukele was in violation of the Constitution. Most egregiously, both times, the president went ahead with his executive orders anyway. I presume you feel it was not appropriate for the president to disregard the will of the National Assembly and the Constitutional Court. Is that fair?
It's not to. Yes, not to disregard the authorities of the court, but I would say this part of the dispute within El Salvador, there's an argument over what powers the president has constitutionally in an emergency, whether he needs enabling legislation from the legislature or not. The three branches are having a robust argument about that. We have tried to urge them all to be respectful of each other and to try to come to some accommodation on a practical way forward. But it's on the theoretical or constitutional level of who has the inherent authority to do one thing or another and what limitations it's subject to. We're trying to see them do a orderly, good faith process, but it's a little bit of political question doctrine too. So we've been reluctant to jump into the middle of the legal debate, as distinct from when you bring troops into a legislature. That's not a legal debate anymore. And in that case, I must say the president ended up deferring to the court that he shouldn't have done that.
Okay, Mr. Ambassador, you might recall in an April 24th press briefing, you were asked about President Bukele's actions on democratic actions. Your comment was, quote, he's got extremely high popularity ratings so far for his handling of the crisis, end quote. I trust you don't believe that his popularity should make him exempt from respecting democratic norms. Is that fair to say?
That is correct, and that was not the intent of my answer. I think that was a longer answer, and one of the other questions had been whether the measures he was taking were too draconian, and I was pointing to the approval ratings of the population for the measures to say apparently they didn't find them to be draconian, but that certainly would not be an excuse or a reason for violating a constitutional separation of powers.
I appreciate that. And lastly, relative to El Salvador, while the Trump administration, has been vocal about the disastrous public health responses in both Venezuela and Nicaragua, it has really been silent about power grabs in El Salvador and Bolivia. So do you believe that the State Department's inconsistency in calling out these governments undermines our interests by feeding into the perception, at least, that our criticisms on human rights grounds are informed by ideology rather than democratic principles?
Sir, I believe our criticisms with respect to both Venezuela and Nicaragua have been a systematic effort to cover up what is going on the medical front, reporting false information, not only to their own populations, but to medical authorities and so on. That's distinct from the legal issues of whether one branch of government has a certain amount of authority over it or not. This is kind of unprecedented areas. But that's why I was saying we have been critical of countries that are falsifying data, basically. We've been much more willing to cut some slack to countries that are struggling to get it right on what's the right balance between shutdowns and opening up your economy and that kind of thing. It's the same kind of issues that we're struggling with at home, and we don't want to try to usurp that decision.
Thank you, Ambassador. And 11?
Yeah, my time is up. Thank you.